On the outer rim of the Kepler chain, tucked between forgotten trade routes and asteroid belts too small to chart, there stood a junkyard that never slept. It was a place where stars came to die, where shattered vessels and broken dreams rusted under the twin suns. And in the heart of this mechanical graveyard, inside a battered tin-roofed workshop stitched together from the skeletons of old ships, worked Hank McCoy. Hank was not a man of grandeur. His hands were rough, blackened with years of grease and burnt circuitry. His tools were old, his methods older, but his touch was pure magic. Engines that should have been scrapped sang again under his care. Systems deemed dead by fleets found second life in the cramped, humming chaos of his shop. He didn't ask where the wreckage came from, or why some of the tech bore seals of empires that had fallen before Earth itself knew the stars. He only fixed. That night. Hank was elbow-deep inside the belly of a broken cryoship. Cursing as he struggled with a stubborn valve. Sparks rained down around him, illuminating the soot-streaked walls lined with spare parts, old banners, and a few battered photographs of a life he barely remembered. Outside, a dust storm whispered across the yard, rattling metal sheets and bending old antennae into mournful weather vanes. He didn't hear the arrival. No ship's whine, no comms request. Just the sudden, heavy hush, the feeling of something vast and ancient pulling the very oxygen out of the room. He froze, spanner half raised, every nerve in his body tingling. Slowly, Hank turned toward the workshop's bay door, drawn by the sense of a presence too large to ignore. There, framed by the storm's swirling dust and the flickering yard lights, stood a creature he had only ever glimpsed in the dusty corners of old myth. A dragon, but not the medieval horrors painted on old Terran scrolls. This being was an alien wonder. Her scales shimmered with the ghost light of dying stars, hues of deep violet and silver melting together as she moved. Her wings, vast and battered, curled protectively around a smaller, frailer form cradled against her chest. For a long moment, neither moved. The storm howled around them, but within that fragile standoff, silence reigned. The dragoness took a slow, shuddering step forward, her talons clicking against the cracked stone floor. Hank noted the trembling in her legs, the dark ichor seeping. From wounds along her side, the desperate tightness in the way she clutched. Yes, she clutched her young. With infinite care, she laid the bundle at the threshold. Her voice, when it came, was not a roar, but a broken plea. A whisper inside Hank's mind, bypassing the need for crude air and sound. Please save him. The youngling at her feet barely stirred. Its breath was shallow, its brilliant scales dim and cracked. Hank knelt instinctively, the mechanic's reflex to diagnose, to fix, overriding the instinct to fear. Up close, he could see the delicate latticework. Embedded within the young dragon's chest, a mechanical core pulsing weakly, blinking with erratic failure codes. It wasn't just a living creature. It was life and machine, intertwined, and the machine part was dying. Hank looked up at the dragoness, his throat dry, his mind racing. "I'm a mechanic," he said aloud, his voice rough. "I fix ships, engines, not—" He gestured helplessly toward the young. "This." The dragoness lowered her head, her breath shuddering against the dusty ground. "You are more than that." The words carried on a tide of ancient sorrow and unyielding hope wrapped around Hank's heart. He thought of the way he could coax life from scrap metal, the way dying ships seemed to breathe again under his touch. He thought of all the lost things he had stitched back together, without ever knowing why it mattered. Maybe it had all been leading to this. Hank pushed aside his doubts. He dragged the workbench closer. He snapped on the overhead light, its harsh glare illuminating the dying young dragon's frail form. His hands moved automatically, clearing space, gathering tools, shifting into the rhythm he knew better than breathing. "I'll try," he said, setting his jaw. And somewhere, deep in the bones of the galaxy, the future shifted, because a human mechanic had just accepted a task no one else would dare attempt, and nothing would ever be the same again. The young dragon lay still, its chest plate of broken biomechanical weave flickering weakly under Hank's inspection lights. Hank hovered over him, heart pounding, sweat trickling down his temple despite the cool air of the workshop. The alien child's breaths were shallow, each one weaker than the last, each exhale a battle against something unseen, gnawing at its life. Hank wiped his hands on a rag and leaned closer, examining the vital core, a shimmering node embedded within the dragon's sternum. It was cracked down the center, like an egg dropped on stone. Tiny fractures radiated outward, some leaking iridescent fluid, others sparking intermittently, organic fibers wrapped around the core like vines strangling a dying tree. He cursed under his breath. This wasn't like any machine he had ever repaired. The technology, if it even could be called that, was half living, half engineered. A symbiosis so intricate that a mistake with a wrench could kill just as easily as negligence. The mother, Lithara, watched him silently, her breathing slow and labored. Her wounds wept starlight, but she did not flinch. Her focus was absolute, locked on the mechanic kneeling before her broken son. Hank exhaled shakily and rolled up his sleeves. He would need to stabilize the vital core before attempting anything else. He grabbed a cluster of microspanners and a portable patch kit, usually reserved for cracked coolant lines. Improvised surgery on alien tech with ship tools. He almost laughed at the insanity of it. Almost. He carefully slipped a sensor probe into one of the core's fractures, monitoring the energy flow. The readings came back sporadic, wild spikes followed by blackouts. He needed to bridge the shattered conduits without overloading the organic matrix. Time was bleeding out. By the second, Hank braced his hands and began. He slid 2 microspanners into place, gingerly levering apart the cracked casing just enough to slip a patching line into the breach. The young dragon twitched but did not wake. Hank bit his lip, steadying the tool, soldering the bypass link in 3 precise micro-welds. The first light returned to the vital core, just a flicker, no more than a breath. But it was enough. Encouraged, Hank worked faster. He repaired what he could, rerouted what he couldn't, building a framework around the damaged heart. He didn't have the materials to rebuild it properly, but he could buy time. Enough for healing, enough for hope. After what felt like hours, Hank placed the final connector, stepped back and waited. At first, nothing. Then, a deep, shuddering breath from the youngling. The lights inside his broken chest brightened, stabilizing to a slow, steady rhythm. The dragon's tiny claw flexed weakly. He was alive. Hank sagged, against the workbench, trembling with relief. He turned toward Lithara, but she was not standing anymore. She was kneeling, her head bowed low to the ground before him, a gesture so ancient and profound that its meaning needed no translation. Vow a bond not of ownership, of honor. You have restored more than a life. Her voice whispered through the workshop, filling every corner with the weight of a promise. You have touched the heart of the stars themselves. And as Hank looked down at the small, breathing bundle of scales, and light, something stirred beyond the edges of the universe, something ancient, something watching, and something very, very interested in a human mechanic who did the impossible. The boy dragon, Rylex, slept for a full day, wrapped in a cocoon of salvage blankets and glowing faintly under Hank's watchful eye. Hank barely slept himself, sitting hunched on a stool, fiddling with the broken casing of a comms transmitter he wasn't really trying to fix. His mind was elsewhere, circling, grappling with what had just happened. He wasn't a healer, he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who knew how to coax broken things into working again. Yet somehow he had repaired a being whose very life was woven with the breath of dying stars. Not with medicine, not with magic, with tools meant for ship engines and duct-taped satellites. The absurdity gnawed at him, even as something deeper settled inside his chest. Something fierce, something proud. Rylex stirred near dusk, his small body twitching beneath the cloth. Hank leaned in as the dragon's silvered eyelids fluttered open. When the young dragon looked up at him, there was no fear in those wide, luminous eyes, only curiosity and something else, something that shimmered in the air between them. Recognition. You fixed me, Rylex said, His voice was a broken whisper, thick with exhaustion but filled with awe, as if he spoke not to a man, but to some impossibility. Hank scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "I just patched you up, kid. You were the one who hung on." Rylek shook his head slowly. His small horns caught the last rays of dying sunlight, casting long shadows against the junk-strewn walls. "No one else could," he said simply. The door creaked behind Hank. Lethara stepped forward, her steps lighter now, though her wounds still wept faint ribbons of starlight. She knelt beside her son, brushing his brow with a claw tender enough to bring a lump to Hank's throat. "You are more than you know, human," she said, her gaze heavy with a meaning Hank couldn't yet grasp. "The core inside my son was not meant to be repaired. Its design is ancient, sealed beyond the reach of even our greatest shapers. It was thought absolute, inviolable." Hank snorted, wiping grime from his face with the sleeve of his jacket. "Well, nobody told me that." Lethara smiled, a strange, solemn thing. "You touched something no one else dared," she said, "and now others will feel it." The ground under the workshop gave a faint, unsettling tremble. Hank looked up sharply. "What do you mean, others?" Before she could answer, a low vibration filled the air, a deep hum, distant yet growing closer like a choir of engines descending from the heavens. The dragons tensed. Hank stood, heart thudding. In the dusk beyond the open bay doors, shapes began to form against the darkening sky. Not ships, not men, beasts, dragons. Dozens of them, some massive, their wings spanning entire city blocks. Blocks, their scales etched with constellations. Others were smaller, quicker, their forms rippling with ghostly light. They circled above the junkyard, casting shifting shadows that danced and leapt over the piles of scrap-like living things. "They have heard the Corers cry," Lethara whispered, "and they are coming to see if the miracle is real." Hank stepped back instinctively as the first dragon landed heavily in the yard, scattering rusted engine parts and sending a gust of warm, charged air washing through the workshop. This dragon was older than Lethara. Its scales were dulled and cracked with age. Its eyes, however, gleamed with sharp intelligence. It leaned down, peering into the open workshop, and it spoke. "Human, show us the starborn you mended." Hank swallowed hard. He glanced at Rylek, who sat up shakily on his pallet, looking between Hank and the dragons gathering like a storm. "They're not here to hurt you," Hank said, more to himself than anyone else. "They're here because you matter. Because somehow a simple act of repair had unraveled threads tied across the galaxy, and things that had slept in silence were waking." Dragons filled the yard now, scales gleaming in every shade of twilight, wings tucked against metal mountains, tails coiling around broken turbines and rusted ship frames. They came in silence save for the occasional deep rumble of breathing, a sound like the slow shifting of glaciers. Their eyes, hundreds of them, locked on the small mechanic's workshop, where a human and a youngling huddled together under a cracked roof. Hank had seen a lot in his years wandering the edge of civilization. Nothing had prepared him for this. He stood rigid at the edge of the workbench, his heart hammering so hard, he thought the dragons might hear it. Rylek sat beside him, tiny compared to the gathered giants. But his vital core pulsed brightly now, strong, defiant, alive. That light had become a beacon, a signal that something impossible had occurred. An ancient dragoness stepped forward from the mass, her horns curled with the heavy weight of centuries, her scales a shade of blue so deep they seemed to drink the failing light. Her voice wrapped around the workshop like velvet and iron. "Who are you, human, to mend what the makers themselves could not?" Hank opened his mouth, then closed it again. He stared at his grease-stained hands, at the dirt under his fingernails, at the tool belt slung low around his hips. "I'm just a mechanic," he said finally, voice rough. A ripple passed through the dragons, an exhalation, a shifting of weight. Not mockery, not scorn, something closer to wonder. The old dragon lowered her great head, the tip of her muzzle brushing the edge of the workshop floor. "You are not just anything," she said. You are what was lost. You are what we forgot to seek. Behind her, a young crimson-scaled drake limped forward, his side marred with the telltale glow of a fractured core. His breathing was shallow. His eyes pleaded without words. Hank understood before anyone could explain. They were not here to conquer. They were here to beg, to hope. Lithara came to his side, her wounded body steady as stone. If you can heal one, she said quietly, you can heal more. Hank looked out over the sea of dragons. At the old and the wounded, the flickering lights embedded deep in their chests. These were not monsters, they were survivors, survivors of a long war, against time, against decay, against the slow betrayal of their own failing hearts, and now, somehow, impossibly, they saw him as a light in their darkness. I don't know if I can, Hank admitted, voice cracking, but I'll try. He stepped forward, toward the young crimson drake, toward the broken core that pulsed faintly beneath its scaled breast. And when he did, grease-stained hands, grease-stained heart wide open, the dragons bowed their great heads in silence. Above them, the stars blinked as if in approval. And across the galaxy, worlds yet untouched by war and ruin trembled on the edge of something new, something born not of power, but of healing. The air inside the workshop thickened, electric and solemn. The dragons shifted, coiling tighter around the broken relics of the junkyard, their massive bodies crowding the borders of the light spilling from Hank's battered workbench. Silence ruled, broken only by the faint hum of Rylex's core, repaired, core and the soft clink of Hank sorting through his old tools with shaking hands. Before him lay the crimson youngling, whose vital core sputtered like a candle fighting the wind. This one was worse off than Rylex had been. The fractures ran deeper, and old scars puckered the organic tissues surrounding the mechanical heart. Whatever battle the Drake had survived, it had left him at the edge of ruin. Hank exhaled slowly and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. The ancient dragoness who had first spoken, Mellorin, loomed nearby, her great eyes heavy with the weight of centuries and 1,000 unspoken fears. You are not bound to this task, she rumbled, her voice low and deep as shifting tectonic plates. You owe us nothing. Hank looked at the youngling's shallow breathing. He thought of Rylex, of the way life had flickered back into that tiny body with nothing more than a stubborn will and hands willing to try. He thought of the broken ships he'd salvaged, each one a whisper of a dream someone had dared to build, and how he'd stitched them back together not for profit, but because something inside him refused to let the broken stay broken. He tightened his grip on the micro-welder. I owe him, Hank said simply. A murmur swept through the gathering dragons. Not words, but a collective shift of breath and energy. An ancient kind of acknowledgement, the sort of oath that didn't need ceremony to be binding. Hank leaned over, the young dragon's vital core scanning the damage, tracing the breaks with a surgeon's care. He could see now that the device wasn't simply failing. It had been tampered with. Sabotaged from the inside. His stomach twisted as he recognized the scorch marks. Directed pulse energy. Someone had wanted this youngling to die. He glanced up at Mellorin. Your people didn't build this core. No, she said, her voice low. It was gifted to us long ago by another race, a race that no longer walks among the living. Then why sabotage it? The old dragon said nothing, but the tightening of her jaw and the flick of her massive tail spoke volumes. There were things Hank wasn't being told, secrets too big for a single mechanic to carry. But the youngling gasped, then a soft whimper escaping his cracked lips, and that was all the answer Hank needed for now. He got to work. He disconnected the fractured energy couplings with the gentleness of a man diffusing a bomb. He rewired the memory lattice of the core, by hand, bypassing corrupted pathways with thin filaments spun from the workshop's emergency fuser, a trick he'd once used to bring a dying freighter's AI back online during a pirate siege. Every move was a gamble. Every weld could either save the youngling or end him. Hours slipped away unnoticed, the workshop's ancient clock ticking into oblivion. Outside, The dragons watched, with a patience that had outlived empires. None spoke, none moved. And when Hank finally sealed the last break, when the crimson core surged with sudden vibrant light, when the youngling's breathing deepened and color flooded back into his scales, the collective exhalation from the gathered dragons was like the slow, reverent sigh of a forest greeting the first spring rain. The young drake blinked up at Hank. Alive. Whole. Saved. Hank slumped back onto the floor, exhausted beyond measure, and smiled. And in that moment, something more profound than gratitude settled over the yard. Hope. Real, searing hope. The healing of the crimson youngling, whose name was revealed to be Zan, was only the beginning. Indeed, the days that followed, dragons came from the farthest reaches of the sector. Broken, dying, cores flickering, they carried the battered remnants of generations with them, each bearing wounds deeper than mere flesh. And Hank, without rest, without a second thought, kept working. He converted half his workshop into what could only be described as a healing forge, a place where core and spirit were mended side by side. He forged custom stabilizers from salvaged alloy. He rethreaded energy veins using techniques once reserved for salvaging ancient jump drives. He listened to the dragon's stories while his hands moved, learning how their people had once been masters of star sailing and how they had lost that art when their vital cores began failing centuries ago. It wasn't just mechanical work anymore. It was restoration. It was redemption. But the galaxy, as always, watched, and some were not pleased by what they saw. The first signal came 2 nights after Zan's recovery. Hank was repairing. The wing, the joint of a young sapphire-scaled dragon named Valea, was midway through a delicate calibration when the workshop's calm screen flickered to life, hissing with a priority transmission. The face that appeared was humanoid but sharp-edged and cold, wearing the crisp uniform of the Varaxian Authority, one of the galaxy's oldest, most secretive power blocks. Their symbol, a hand grasping a burning star, glowed behind the man's shoulder. Human, the Varaxian envoy said, voice clipped, metallic. You are in violation of the Progenitor Secrecy Accord. Cease all unauthorized core manipulations immediately. Failure to comply will result in termination. Hank stared at the screen. Then he unplugged it. The dragons growled low and deep. They understood. The Varaxians had been the ones to gift the vital cores long ago. They had embedded weakness, dependency, control, keeping the dragons bound to survival systems they could not repair on their own. Quietly, invisibly, they had turned the most ancient of species into prisoners in their own bodies. And now, a human mechanic had broken that control. Hank turned back to Valea, his voice steady. Let them come. Behind him, the repaired dragons, Relich, Zeon, and others, unfurled their wings. Their cores pulsed with a new light, a brighter light, a free light. The storm was coming. But this time it would not find a broken people waiting in the dark. It would find a rising tide, a mechanic and his dragons, ready. The attack came just before sunrise, when the junkyard was steeped in the quiet stillness of half-light, and the stars were still visible, like old scars across the sky. Hank had fallen asleep against the side of the workshop, a wrench still clutched in his hand. When the first missile screamed through the atmosphere, it struck the perimeter fence, vaporizing it in a flash of searing blue light, sending molten metal flying through the air. Hank jerked awake as the ground shuddered beneath him, heart hammering before his mind even caught up. Dragons roared from their resting places among the junk heaps, wings snapping open like thunderclaps. Above them, Varaxian assault skiffs dropped from the clouds, sleek and black. Their underbellies bristled with containment grids and null screamers, devices designed to scramble core signatures and shut down any dragon caught within their net. Hank didn't wait for orders. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the emergency control panel wired hastily to the old junkyard defenses. They were ancient, barely functional, but with a little patchwork magic, they'd have to be enough. He slammed his hand on the ignition switch. The old pulse cannons, salvaged from derelict warships and welded into the junk walls, coughed once, then roared to life, lancing beams of golden energy into the descending Varaxian ships. One skiff spiraled out of control, crashing into a pile of broken reactors with an ear-splitting explosion. Dragons rose into the air, dozens of them, their newly mended cores burning so brightly the sky seemed to catch fire. Relik flew in tight spirals, darting between skiffs with a speed the Varaxians clearly hadn't anticipated. Zevran, heavier but brutal in his momentum, slammed into one ship like a comet, tearing through its hull with raw force. Still, the Varaxians pushed forward. They deployed containment nets, strands of cold energy unfurling across the sky, trying to trap and choke the dragons mid-flight. One of the nets struck Valaya, wrapping around her like chains, her core flickering dangerously. She screamed, wings folding. Hank didn't think. He grabbed the prototype disruptor he'd built from spare parts and sprinted across the open yard, skidding under the swooping shadow of a skiff, aiming the jury-rigged device at the net anchoring Valaya to the ground. He fired. The disruptor belched a cone of magnetic noise so strong it tore the net apart in a shower of sparks. Valaya dropped heavily, but she was free and alive. The dragons saw. They responded. They didn't just fight harder, they fought smarter. Coordinated strikes, rapid dives, breath attacks aimed precisely at skiff engines, not indiscriminately at their armored sides. They moved as if sharing a single mind. The Varaxians weren't ready for dragons who could think beyond survival. They certainly weren't ready for a human leading them. When the last skiff turned tail, limping for orbit, it left behind a battlefield not of corpses, but of defiance. The dragons landed, battered and bloody, but victorious. Hank leaned against the blackened remains of a containment grid, panting, feeling the adrenaline ebb from his system. He looked up at the dragons who gathered around him. They didn't speak. They bowed one by one. A mechanic, a man of grease and grit and stubborn hands, had become something else in their eyes. Not just a savior, a leader. And the galaxy would hear about it. Whether it was ready or not, word traveled, faster than any ship. By the time the second Varaxian fleet mustered for a full assault, half the outer colonies knew about the mechanic who defied death, who healed the dragons history had abandoned. To some, Hank became a symbol of dangerous rebellion. To others, a beacon of impossible hope. It was not only dragons who came now. Other species, once cowed by the silent grip of the Varaxians, arrived in battered ships and ancient transports, bringing their broken, their wounded, their forgotten. They sought healing, not just of body, but of spirit. Hank's junkyard transformed overnight into a living citadel. Makeshift clinics were carved from the hulls of crashed freighters. The forge expanded, now blazing day and night. Dragons not yet strong enough to fight took shifts hauling scrap, building walls, installing shield generators crafted from salvage tech. They worked together. They bled together. They became more. And at the heart of it all stood Hank, grease-smeared and sleepless, stubborn as ever. He didn't ask for followers. He didn't ask for legend. But it came anyway. The Varaxians saw the spreading fire and panicked. Their second fleet was 3 times the size of the first. Dreadnoughts bristling with nullifier cannons. Squadrons of elite hunters trained specifically to shatter dragonkind. They came not to capture, but to crush. Hank stood atop a salvaged gun tower as the dark shapes of the fleet filled the upper sky like a rotting tide. Beside him stood Rylich, now fully grown into a life-radiant dragon whose core burned with a light fierce enough to leave after images. "This won't be like before," Rylich said, his voice deeper, older. Hank nodded. "I know." "Are you ready?" the dragon asked. Hank cracked a tired grin, flipping a wrench in one hand like a gunslinger about to draw. "I didn't fix all of you just to watch you get broken again." The first shots lanced down from orbit, energy beams meant to cleave the ground into slag. The newly erected shields flared to life, absorbing the initial assault. Dragons leapt into the sky, rising into fire like shooting stars made flesh. Hank looked up, shielding his eyes, and he realized something strange. He wasn't scared. He was angry, furious that something so beautiful had been forced to hide for so long, furious that power had been used not to protect, but to imprison. He slammed his hand onto the comms panel wired into the side of the tower. "All wings, all units," he growled. "Give them a message." "What message?" Rylick asked, wings tensing, core flaring. Hank smiled, baring his teeth. "Tell them the galaxy belongs to the ones who fix what's broken." And with a roar that cracked the sky open, the dragons answered.